All right. We live in a very beautiful place, and I hope everyone has experienced this. Go deep into the woods. It doesn't have to be far. Any green wooded place where you can't see the parking lot anymore. Don't take your kids or your friends or your dog. Take out your headphones and try not to define any individual tree or plant. Fall into the scene. Listen to the life around you, the creaking of the leaves, the rustling of the limbs. Allow your eyes to blur into a soft sea of green and feel it in your body and know that it says, listen. It's not spoken and you don't hear it with your ears, but you know it in your whole body. There's a porous quality to it. You're aware. Welcome. You're aware that we exhale carbon dioxide and plants exhale oxygen. For a planet that's 70% nitrogen, that's a pretty nice function. We've breathed each other in and out of existence, one made by exhaling the other. And yet humans believe that we're the most dominant species on Earth. But when you look at the numbers, one form of life truly rules the Earth. In terms of population, humans make up less than 0.01% of life on Earth. The animal kingdom is 0.4%. The plant kingdom dominates at 82%. Meaning there would have to be over 56 trillion people on the Earth to surpass plants as the dominant life forms. Plants have a 125 million a year head start on Earth's first land vertebrates and a 425 million year head start on the first humans. They literally made the world before us and for us. Flowerless, rootless, spore-producing plants of a Precambrian age, mats of organized green algae floating below the surface of the shallow sea, multiplied and built Earth's atmosphere, allowing for more complex forms of life to emerge. The first vertebrate life took over the ocean in the Ordovician period. Stuff like that. Oh. All this is to say that plants have a history far greater than animal life and could be considered cognizant of a greater purpose based on lessons learned eons ago. In addition to their own Darwinian success, a purpose and niche the communities in which individual plants live. But before posing any questions about their purpose or what is the consciousness of plants, we must determine what we are talking about in the first place. People use the term consciousness in a variety of ways. For example, a state of wakefulness, a sense of self, or the capacity for self-reflection, being cognizant, being sentient, and one of my favorite confusing terms, subjective experience. Imagine a human blastocyst of less than 20 cells. We assume that there is nothing we assume there is nothing that it is to be like this microscopic collection of cells. With time, these cells multiply into a human with a human brain, able to detect changes in light and temperature and its own mother's voice. Unlike a simple measurement that can detect changes in light and recognize a voice, these processes come with an experience of light and sound. At whatever point your intuition tells you, okay, now something is being experienced in there, the mystery lies in the transition. At what point does something achieve consciousness? What fold in the brain or organization in the cells leads to an organism knowing itself? At some point there is nothing, and then suddenly at just the right moment, something is experiencing itself. However minimal that initial something is, experience explodes in the inanimate world, bringing light to the darkness. After all, the infinite is made up of particles indistinguishable of those from the sun. The particles that make up our bodies were once the stuff of stars in universes past. Like Carl Sagan said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you need to go back to the beginning of the universe. And the same is true for us in our consciousness. Our consciousness traveled for billions of years in this configuration to form you right here, right now, having an experience of this talk. Imagine following the life of those particles from the very beginning in space and time to the very moment they became arranged in such a way as to start experiencing something. If we can't find a dividing line or moment, which we still haven't, this leaves the question, is consciousness everywhere? When we look closely, we can't find reliable external physical evidence of consciousness, nor can we point to the function it serves. If we can't point to anything that distinguishes which cells or even atoms are conscious and which are not, where can we draw a line? A more interesting question is, why draw a line at all? When we view our own experience as being along for the ride, observing inside our own experience, we free ourselves. Consider the possibility that all matter is imbued with consciousness. This view is what Plato, there he is, Renaissance figure Francisco Patrizzi, and modern philosopher David Chalmers, among others, refer to as panpsychism. In the 19th century, panpsychism was the default philosophy of mind in Western thought before being replaced by ideas of dualism or materialism in the 20th century. However, developments in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and quantum physics have revived interest in panpsychism in the 21st century. I myself personally fought very hard against this philosophy, but more and more it seems like the only explanation for consciousness that makes any sense. If the behaviors of animals, including ourselves, can be imbued with consciousness, why not plants? Or the spin of electrons? Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental property of matter. Perhaps consciousness precedes matter. It's worth posing the question, and to me, panpsychism is the only logical explanation. Consciousness is part of the fundamental physical forces and fields like gravity, electromagnetism, and light, heavy nuclear forces. This approach, while extremely wild, is informed by science and is fully aligned with scientific reasoning. As the philosopher Philip Goff said, panpsychism is crazy, but it's also most likely probably true. Physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter, other than physical matter has experience. Simply put, panpsychism just makes logical sense. It's the simplest, most straightforward explanation for what David Chalmers refers to as the hard problem of consciousness. In short, what Chalmers describes is the problem of explaining why any physical state is conscious rather than not conscious. The question of plant consciousness, when taken from this perspective, inherently breaks the taxonomic boundary. Plant knowledge is in and with plants themselves, never lost, always available. Plants predated and co-evolved with humans. New properties and functions emerged as new needs developed. They rolled out the leafy green carpet for all organisms that would come after. Plants are a conscious population, far greater and far older than us. Unfortunately, the taxonomy that cemented our current understanding of plants dates back to Aristotle, perhaps the most influential thinker in all of Western history. By defining insensitivity as the key criteria for differentiating plants from animals, including human beings, and positioning plants outside of the domain of sensitive life, Aristotle had in effect, transformed plants into objects. This is a spurious idea that allows the human a right to use and abuse plants, and that exempt us from any sense of responsibility or respect towards them as living beings. Aristotle's perspective of the sensorial world had a profound and long-lasting influence on eventually everyone who came after him, beginning with his own pupil, Theosophites, who, despite his own observations of active behavior in many different plant species, chose to subscribe to Aristotle's belief of plant passivity and insensitivity. Unfortunately, this ancient mistake was passed down for millennia, going against what we know of Darwinian theory and of natural selection. In fact, half a century before Darwin in 1809, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck called into question the objectivity of rank-based classification of life in his philosophy zoology by saying, classes, orders, families, genera, and nomenclatures are weapons of our own invention. We could not do without them, but we must use them with discretion. Among her productions, nature has not really formed either classes, orders, families, genera, or constant species, but only individuals who succeed one another and resemble those from which they sprung. Greater diversity and genetic variation ensures a greater ecosystem sustainability. Systems more resilient to stress and recovery from adverse conditions are invariably the more diverse. The uniformity of Aristotle does not include the blurring of the taxonomic boundary we see all the time, especially as it relates to a panpsychical approach to animal and plant consciousness. In 1966, a CIA polygraph technician named Cleve Baxter was working late when he fixated on a potted plant in his office, a small succulent shrub. He was familiar with the work of early 20th century researcher and physicist Jagadish Chandra Bose, who claimed to have discovered that playing certain kinds of music in the area where plants grew caused them to grow faster. So Cleve Baxter wondered, what would happen if he hooked his plant up to his polygraph machine? You can guess where it went from there. There was only one way to find out. Baxter attached the electrodes to the succulent leaf. He switched on the polygraph and watched the readings as he added water to the plant's soils. Shockingly, the galvanometer jumped. The plant was giving off spikes of satisfied energy. Taking things a step further, he visualized himself setting the plant on fire. With nothing but a thought, the plant's polygraph readings spiked. With this information, Baxter and anyone else has to wonder, can plants read our minds? Baxter and his team experimented with dozens of types of plants, including fruits and vegetables. His records indicated similar results. Most plants can sense a human thoughts or intentions before they are acted upon. Despite the occasional dubious result, Cleve Baxter's work became the legitimate field of study known as plant neurobiology. Plant neurobiology, it should be noted, is a complete misnomer. Plants do not have brains, and they do not have neurons. They have a chemical system that sends signals through their body, simulating what we could understand as their version of senses. For example, plants can respond to chemicals in the air and on their leaves. So in a way, they can taste and smell. They can essentially see. How else could you describe the way they react differently depending on lights and shadow? And when a root or vine comes across a foreign object, it knows to grow around it, just like a sense of touch. In one experiment, researcher Michael Pollan found plants secreted defensive chemicals when he played a recording of a munching caterpillar. So in some sense, plants can even hear. At the Beijing, China Agricultural University, researchers expanded on Jagadish Chandra Bose's theories on an industrial scale. They found plants yield more produce when they regularly listen to music. They proved unequivocally that music improved plants like cucumbers, peppers, spinach, cotton, and rice's ability to fight off diseases and molds. Scientists continue to test these theories, and we can do the same at home. This is my friend Soraya Dosset, and in 2021, upon receiving her Reiki certification, she conducted a simple experiment with 2 samples of plain white rice. She sterilized 2 containers, put the white rice in them both. She marked one of them as R, and every day for a month for 5 minutes, she would do Reiki on the rice in the container marked R. After a month, the positive rice remained clean, whereas the rice received no attention, began to develop mold, and turned yellow. You can do this at home, like tonight. I mean, it takes some money. When I moved to Seattle for college in 2002, I was living in North Seattle and commuting to Capitol Hill. I have a very distinct memory that when I would return home in the evening of hearing tiny elf-like conversations coming from a neighbor's garden. After a few incidents, I tried to get a closer look to investigate and discovered multiple planter boxes fitted with small speakers playing talk radio. Evidently, this neighbor felt the need to give their growing vegetables an evening conversational wind down, care of a local NPR affiliate. In 1976, early electronic music pioneer Mort Garson released Mother Earth's Plantasia, predating Stevie Wonder's The Secret Life of Plants by 3 years, but another album with a similar intention. Garson's Mother Earth's Plantasia was the first known album to be produced mainly for a floral audience. With track names like Symphony for a Spider Plant, and Ode to the African Violet, the album's soothing tones were intended to encourage plant growth. In 2023, the album's title track, Plantasia, was repurposed by Corporation Intuit in a series of advertisements for their popular TurboTax software, showing that Garson's quote-unquote warm earth music for plants and the people that love them can work just as well to soothe the 21st century human's fear of an audit. And it's not just sound that a plant can quantifiably perceive. It's thought that plants actually have 10 to 15 more senses than humans do. All right. Plants can detect gravity, pressure, volume, toxins, and even harmful microbes. If plants can receive this information, it stands to reason that they make decisions based on it, like where they want their roots to grow, how many fruiting bodies to produce, or how to respond to external threats. Every plant is a free thinker. Biologist Monica Gagliano and her team at the University of Western Australia devised a test to see how well peas could hear, with an extremely surprising result. She started by placing several pea shoots in a simple upside-down Y-shaped piece of PVC pipe. Now, plants can sense what's known as soil moisture gradient. And what if both sides of the Y-shaped pipe contained the exact same level of soil moisture, but one was fitted with a speaker playing the sounds of running water? I, along with Dr. Gagliano, would assume the pea's roots would move toward the sound of the flowing water, but they didn't. In most cases, the roots avoided the end playing the sound of the running water. Why? It wasn't until another speaker playing white noise was attached to the other end of the growing pipe did the pea roots decide to move in the direction of the running water every single time. What the team had discovered was the roots' ability to perceive the mildest electromagnetic field given off by the speakers. It was only when both ends had speakers attached did the little pea roots decide to go for the sound of the rushing water. Not only did the pea sprouts hear and differentiate the sounds, they made a decision to avoid an electromagnetic field. Mammals can't do this, at least not in any sort of measurable fashion. In addition to this multi-level decision-making, plants can even recall the past. It needs to wait to do its little move. It does. All right. In a 2014 study, that same team at the University of Western Australia proved certain plants can form memories. Dr. Gagliano and her team studied an incredible little plant known as the Mimosa pudica. This plant has the unique ability to coil its leaves when it senses danger. Mimosa's powerful performance of folding and unfolding their leaves when receiving contact or stress, in a way, reminds us of the purposeful movement of animals, creating a strange and extraordinary bridge between the taxonomic barrier of so-called sensitive and insensitive animal and vegetal kingdoms. The researchers wondered, could they use mimosa's sensitivity to test plant learning, memory, and decision-making? Long-term memory can be described in animals in relation to changes in synaptic connectivity expressed in the brain, a thought that interacts with a wide range of molecules across a complex network. Understood from this perspective, memory is inevitably contingent on the existence of a brain, and from there we're in a corner. Frail arguments to advance our knowledge, such as plants have no brain and no synapses to retain memory, therefore how can they do any actual remembering? During the study, Gagliano placed the mimosa in small cups and dropped the plant from the height of a few centimeters every 5 seconds. Each time, the plants retracted its leaves. But after several impacts, something very interesting happened. The plant stopped defending itself. It kept its leaves in the outward position. The team of researchers placed the plants on vibrating plates, and they again recoiled their leaves. Gagliano tested the plants 3 days later with the same results, proving that Mimosa pudica could remember for days. It hadn't gotten hurt the last few times it fell. Whether it was remembering Dr. Gagliano or being placed in the cup or the slight impact itself, we don't know. The team continued the study on dozens of mimosa plants, all with similar results. No one can figure out how they made these memories, especially without a brain. So far, our best guess is that plants use a calcium-based network that simulates neurons within their cells. There's also overwhelming evidence that plants can recognize one another, specifically seedlings that are related to them. In 2007, a team of Canadian scientists monitored a plant known as the sea rocket. When seeds from the same mother plant grew next to each other, the new buds competed less aggressively for resources. They cooperated with their family members. Another study at the University of Delaware found plants that grew next to related organisms were more likely to intertwine their roots and work together. Those that grew next to strangers sprouted upright and avoided direct contact with their neighbors. Andrew, what's this called? Where the trees avoid the other trees that they don't know? Oh, it's like crowding. So plants recognize each other and are weary of strangers. Additionally, there's evidence that plants form alliances across species. Imagine an alien culture studying the human race for the last several decades and just finding out about the internet this morning. That's essentially what happened with the recent discovery of what biologists have affectionately referred to as the Wood Wide Web. This is a web of mycelial fungus that wraps around the tangled roots of the majority of the world's trees. It acts like an organic internet. As researcher Merlin Sheldrake inelegantly describes it, almost all trees on planet Earth are web pages, with this mycelial fungal network acting as hyperlinks. It's inelegant because Sheldrake admits that's just the best way we can understand it, and the reality is far more difficult for us to comprehend. This mycelial network allows trees to send messages to other plants. They can even search for information they need for their environment. This is how trees share water and other nutrients they might be lacking, or how a shaded tree acquires resources from one with an abundance of sun. That's why here in the Pacific Northwest, you'll see red cedars near big leaf maples. The two trees are commonly connected by a mycelial network that allows the cedar to send nutrients and carbon to the maple during the winter months when it loses its leaves and can't photosynthesize. In the warm, dry summer, the maple will send nutrients and carbon back to the cedar. That's 3 unrelated species across 2 kingdoms working together to survive and thrive. They've been doing it under our feet for millions of years, and researchers are just now beginning to notice it. They can also send distress signals if they're attacked, within but not entirely beholden to this fungal network. Above the ground, plants release pheromones and other scent signals into the air. In sub-Saharan Africa, giraffes eat the leaves of the acacia tree. The acacia tree emits a gas telling its neighboring plants to produce more tannins in their leaves. This makes the foliage bitter to the giraffe, and in large enough quantities has even been known to kill the giraffe. Plants can organize to react and even kill one of the largest land mammals. There's countless spiritual and religious plant life that occurs throughout our shared records. Druids with their sacred oaks, a crown of laurels, roses, or the holy thorn tree. But one plant could be argued to occur the most in historical, cultural, and spiritual significance. That would be Nelumbo nuciferia, or the sacred lotus flower. It is a sacred flower in both Hinduism and Buddhism, representing the creation of the universe, the path to spiritual awakening and enlightenment. It holds significance for the Jains in India and early Christians. In ancient Egypt, it grew on the banks of the Nile, represented the path from death to rebirth in the afterlife. It's an important position in yoga, and there's Odysseus and the lotus eaters from Greek mythology. But what about this plant, besides its obvious beauty, has made it so captivating? It truly is one of a kind. Starting at the roots, it grows in the mud below the water, not floating like a seaweed. Nelumbo nuciferia anchors itself to the earth element. The roots connected in an edible tuber instead of a standard root bunch for other aquatic plants. It then grows through a watery element, and this is very important, its seed pods, leaves, and flowers bloom far off the surface of the water in an airy element. Most other aquatic plants, lilies, for example, don't do this. They stay on the surface of the water and spread out. Only the sacred lotus flower moves through all three of these elements. But there's a fourth primordial element the lotus embodies. Does anyone want to guess what it is? What's the fourth one? It's fire. It's fire. So this was where I got into a conundrum because I wanted to figure out what the fourth possibility was. At first I was thinking, oh, the purple and blue flowers could certainly represent a fiery element. But there's a more exciting discovery being made. In 2018, researchers at the University of Wollongong in Australia created these infrared images. Turns out Nelumbo nuciferea is part of a rare group of plants that are thermogenic. Thermogenic plants have the ability to raise their temperature above that of the surrounding air. Heat is generated in the mitochondria as a secondary process of cellular respiration. This thermogenesis is similar to the process of uncoupling proteins found in mammals, allowing a process which is poorly understood. The Araceae family of flowering plants contain the most species that are thermogenic. The skunk cabbage, elephant foot yam, and voodoo lily all produce heat in a similar way to mammals. Outside of this family, only the sacred lotus flower shows a thermogenic process. It is also the only plant to be both thermogenic, it produces heat, and endothermic, it is able to regulate its flower's temperature. It is the only photosynthetic organism to be known to do this. As these images show, the stamens of the flower produce a tremendous amount of heat and continue this process of cellular respiration even after being detached from the whole flower. From learning about the elemental nature of the lotus flower, I was curious to know who was the first god of plants and vegetation, the first divine personification of a growing world. This is difficult since individual plants contain their own spirits. There's gods for grain, gods for the harvest, gods for flowers, and so on. But I believe the Mesopotamian patron god Nebu from 3500 BC to be a compelling candidate. His name in Akkadian means to announce and prophesize. He was the third and only living son of Marduk, the father god, and patron deity of Babylon. Nebu was the patron god of scribes, literacy, and wisdom. He invented writing, the rational arts, and was the god and overseer of all vegetation. Nebu inscribed the fates of men, along with Ninurta, the god of law and farming, and the moon god Sin. Nebu's cult spread to ancient Egypt and was one of the 5 non-Egyptian deities to be worshipped on the island of Elephantine in Upper Egypt. Over the centuries, Nebu influenced the Egyptian gods Amun, Osiris, and Thoth. He's associated with Mercury and Hermes, and in the Mandean cosmology, the name for Mercury is Enbu. I find it fascinating that Nebu and Ninurta were both early gods of writing, the law, vegetation, and farming. Whereas later cultures separated the two, Osiris for plant life and Thoth for writing, in ancient Egypt, for example, until you consider the origins of the Mesopotamian system of writing, cuneiform. Today we use a pen and paper, computer, or smartphone to communicate, but the earliest language was simply grown and plucked. The land of Mesopotamia was built on rich clay. In order to write a letter, a receipt, or a story, one simply had to scoop up a small handful of clay and break off a nearby reed. Clay would be cradled in the left hand while the right hand would create a system of notches in the wet clay. There weren't stationary stores or receipt paper. Communication was simply grown and plucked from the earth. And ultimately, that's the role of plant consciousness to me. Communication with us, communication to us. As individuals, plants feed us and they teach us. They're greater in number and wiser in history than we could ever hope to be. Plants show us that all knowledge is borrowed knowledge. There is nothing we can teach a plant because they created us. They hold the answers, and it is up to us to decide the questions. We must move from notions of ownership to ones of custodians. Go back to the woods, back to the green where you can't see the parking lot anymore. Listen for the answers without knowing the questions. Surround yourself and just listen. Thank you.